This puts the money in the hands of people who actually need it, which is superior to the two realistic alternatives by which governments can spend themselves out of recession, either spending on welfare or subsidies or on lowering interest rates through the central bank. This is why the government team will win the debate. I want to try and be clear at the beginning of this how we're going to do it. There is some debate in the motion clarification channel. This debate assumes that the states we're operating in have some form of progressive taxation system because they have thresholds and brackets by which people's income tax that they pay are determined. So there is a set of people in the status quo in these states who don't pay any income tax because they earn below the lower bound. In Australia, I think it's about 18,000 Australian dollars a year. None of that money is taxed. What we're proposing to do in this debate is to increase the amount of money that you have to earn in order to be affected by the tax system. So if this were Australia, we would raise it to something like 25,000 Australian dollars per year before you begin to pay income tax on your income. So that would effectively increase the number of people who are not paying income tax. And for everyone who pays income tax, it increases the amount of money that they receive that is not being taxed at the rate of the lowest bracket in the income tax regime. So every single person who earns more than the lowest bound of income is receiving some money back from the government. So that's probably affects people who like have the least amount of money the most. Like it gives them back like $2,000 or $3,000, which is a year, which is pretty significant. But it also affects everyone. Everyone gets some tax money back. The effect of which is that on net, this is lowering tax. This is giving people money back. Okay, hope that's not too complicated. If there's a POI on that, I'm happy to take it. Cool, no. Let's get into the first alternative by which governments can spend money, which is, assumably the counterfact on this debate is that governments have more tax available to them and they can do more spending. And we're going to argue that that is inferior to the way that consumers with that money would be able to spend. The first is the context where states have weak infrastructure, which I would say is a particularly likely context given we're talking about states that are in recession. And these states are often extraordinarily politically captured and corrupt and spend in ways such as doing hugely expensive fuel subsidies, which are endemic across Latin America, which are quite regressive and bad. They are regressive because they benefit people who use things like fuel the most, which tends to skew towards richer people, but also they're quite environmentally damaging and hard to remove because people become reliant on them. The other thing that's bad about these kinds of politically captured ways of government spending, which they would do with more income tax, is that it is honestly pretty hard to identify which businesses are productive and which are not, and there are subject to political constraints as well. Usually, governments are politically constrained by the fact there is some demand to evenly spread their subsidies, but consumers, on the other hand, organically select businesses to spend on and stimulate that give them the best value, i.e. the best balance between the price and the product, which are the kinds of businesses that are good to stimulate, that are good to select for, because that is probably the businesses that are most likely to get you out of a recession, than are things that are ultimately going to receive a subsidy but not going to provide a productive product, that ultimately aren't going to, in the long term or the medium term, be the kind of thing that gets you out of a recession. So consumers are far better spending with their own feet than our governments trying to identify on an economy-wide level, especially subject to political constraints, what kinds of businesses are worth spending on. But even if that weren't true, there are enormous barriers to access to the ways that governments try to give back and try to give money through taxation systems to people who are vulnerable in times of recession, things like welfare. And welfare systems are often deliberately obfuscated because if people don't opt into accessing welfare systems, then governments have more money available to them. So it means that there is specific governmental incentives to make the process of applying for and obtaining welfare labyrinthine, complicated, and make it so that people aren't super aware of the things that are available to them. All of which makes those kinds of systems far more aggressive than simply giving everyone who is subject to the government's rules some money back in this time of recession, because the people who are the lowest information, who are the most sympathetic, who aren't able to access systems of government or who are uncomfortable doing so, get money in our world, but they do not get money in the world of opposition. They have it taxed from them, which is bad because those people are worth, in times of crisis, when people have cost of living pressures on them, having money spent back into them. So that set of people get money in our world, but they don't get money in the other team's world, which is great. Plus, finally, it's much easier now to do things like welfare spending. It's much easier to do what we're proposing than it is to do welfare spending, because lowering tax rates for everyone makes everyone feel like they're benefiting, even the richest people because they're getting some money back. Tax feels burdensome, and lowering the burdens of tax on people honestly feels good. So it is much, much more politically popular in general to lower tax rates than it is to do, for instance, welfare spending with tax or subsidies with tax on particular industries that don't affect people, because those things are perceived as spending my money on something that I don't care about or it doesn't affect me, as compared to tax, which benefits everyone who does it. Which means that pound for pound, what we can politically achieve in this debate is we can achieve far more of money in people's hands than they are able to achieve on their side. All of which means these programs are more robust and affect people more profoundly. I'll take a POI.
So if government infrastructure is as weak as you claim, it's unlikely that businesses can scale to an extent where they can kickstart the economy again. Why shouldn't the government have jurisdiction to select which industries will rebound most efficiently in times of crisis?
Because, as I've explained, they're often politically captured as compared to consumers, which tend to spend on the things that affect them, which organically scales for the kinds of businesses that are most likely to be productive into the long term. Please listen to mechanisms before you ask POIs. Fourth, this targets lower income people the most because they get the most money back. And that means that the people who often aren't demanding things, or aren't, even if they demand things, aren't capable of spending and stimulating the economy now can spend, which is a realistic route out of recessions, all of which is good. Finally, the realistic alternative to this in terms of fiscal policy is monetary policy, is central banks lowering interest rates, which is inferior as a policy than this. Because first, lowering interest, and the reason you'd lower interest rates is give people more access to credit, right? Which is bad because it deters foreign direct investment, which in systems that are poor and are struggling to produce things is a pretty bad thing. The reason that this deters foreign direct investment is because if you have loans or your returns on investment become lower because the interest rates are lower, which means that foreign direct investment doesn't come as much. And in terms of states that are in recession, foreign direct investment is pretty good, and in the long term is often a strategy out of them. But also it has undesirable currency effect because it lowers the demand for your currency, because again, there are less returns on the investments that you make into that currency, which means that if your country has an import problem and you need to import stuff, your currency becomes less valuable and it becomes harder to buy things, all of which exacerbates the problems of that recession as well. That is why monetary policy is inferior as well. For that reason, proud to propose, govern, affirm, I don't know what the fuck it is.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much for that, Prime Minister. Okay, Leader of Opposition, please, hear, hear.
Am I clearly audible?
Hi, yes, you're audible.
All right, I'll just take like a few seconds to rinse my notes, please, guys. Thank you. All right, so I take POIs verbally, please, but don't badger. Anyway, I'll start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Our case is very simple in this debate. We're going to support two things. Firstly, that our side of the house earns substantially more money for the government to spend and not just like a marginal amount. And secondly, on why we are the most likely to be able to fix a recession and make the lives of people better, right? Before that, I want to clarify something important, panel. Notice that we don't have to support decreasing the threshold for income tax. Right? So we don't make more people artificially pay more taxes. We just keep the income tax the same. So any future argument about like backlash or anything of that sort won't happen because people are used to the status quo and don't perceive there to be high levels of tax rates because people are just used to that being the norm, right? But the second thing you notice that progressive taxation is still a thing. That is to say, I don't think we're going to make like a person earning $12,000 a year pay like 30% income tax. It's probably going to be like 5% and 10%, right? So it's like generally speaking, even if you do increase the threshold slightly, these individual people don't have to pay huge amounts of money. So all the claims they make about, oh, you have like way more disposable income, realistically makes no sense to me, because you aren't going to be paying that much in taxes anyway. There's a marginal decrease to that. But I'm going to explain why. I know this sounds contradictory, but I'm going to explain why this is an actually reduced amount of money we have in terms of lump sum that the government earns. POI is in chat, by the way, right? Before I move on to argumentation, I want to respond to proposition's case. The first thing that they say is that these states tend to be extraordinarily politically captured, and that means that it's better to trust people with the money than these governments, right? I have three responses. One, trivially speaking, not every single state that's in recession is corrupted, right? The USA has gone through recession. Many countries in, for example, like the Southeast Asian region that aren't like completely like shit poor have gone through recession, right? Like it's like a natural part of many economies. They go through cycles of recession in some cases. So not all of these are automatically corrupted. They have to prove structured analysis as to why this is the case. Right. Secondarily, I just think that states in times of recession are the most likely to overcome their corrupted behaviors and try to act as pragmatically as possible. One, in times of crisis, people hold the government to the highest standard, right? Because that is when they perceive the recession to be the failure of the government. Now it's in their direct pragmatic interest to care about politics, to care about what the government is doing and hold them accountable, right? So they're more likely to go out and be agitated and vote and things like that because they're pissed off. But secondarily, even if you don't have democracies, you still have things like protesting, right? Notice that in times of recession, the government wants to bounce back the economy, increase spending, stabilize the system, stop the bleeding. What you don't want is millions of people who are all, by the way, affected by the same recession, out on the streets instead of trying to work, instead of trying to spend their stimulus packages, so on and so forth. So governments really don't want to do this. But the third thing to point out is that recessions also pragmatically hurt the government, right? Because the government also can do things like spending on like good infrastructure that boosts their reputation and leads them to be voted in the future. It limits their own salaries in many cases because they can't really adjust the budget because they can't spend more on themselves, so on and so forth. So it is in the direct pragmatic interest panel to save the recession and not, for example, like act in politically captured ways. The intuition they give you is like, oh, you spend more on oil. Number one, a huge number of people use oil. Every single business in developing nations use oil. So it's not really like a rich person thing. It is every human being thing. But secondarily, like, sure, like some pollution maybe happens, some exogenous harm happens. We don't really care. The recession is more important. I'll explain later on. The second thing that they say is just nonsensical. They said it's way too complicated to be able to like get people this money, and therefore like there's gonna be like barriers to entry to this. One, in many cases, just a stimulus package sent to you via mail, so it's not that complicated. But secondarily, the government is spending millions of dollars in welfare systems, and to increase welfare, they presumably want people to be able to access it and not just like fuck over the poor just because we can. So their argument makes sense in debate land, but in reality, that doesn't really hold water. Before I move on to my first claim about more money and substantially more money, I will take that point. Go ahead.
Your claim that this is a small amount of money mitigates your case, but not ours, because experientially, it means a lot to the people who already have a small amount of money, but it doesn't mean a lot to the government who has a large amount of money.
Yes, excellent, right? That's literally my current argument. But to explain why it doesn't experientially mean anything, right? Because the vast majority of people aren't aware of things like adjusting taxation rates and how to deal with recessions, right? All they see is like on their side, you're making a change, right? People are earning, people are like, earn, like they having spend less tax, right? Yes, I understand on your side, people know that their taxation habits are changing. In our side, you're used to this, right? You're used to the norm. So you don't perceive like something terrible is happening because you're always used to the tax rate being 5%. You were always used to the threshold being $1,000 or something of that sort. Like, so that argument doesn't make sense either. Firstly, what if we have significantly more money? The first thing I want to point out is that while we tax individuals less, I want to point out on an aggregate, we're able to get a huge amount of money. One, notice that the countries that are the most likely to go into recession tend to be more vulnerable economies, developing states, right? What are the characteristics of these states? One, they tend to have really high population, right? Like countries like Bangladesh is like 2% of the global population. India has 1 billion people. Indonesia is also like has a huge amount of people, so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot of people in these countries who are, by virtue of statistics, not paying taxes on their side of the house. But secondarily, notice that adjusting the threshold slightly ultimately increases significant, it leads to significantly more people not paying taxes, right? Because there's a huge amount of people in the low, median income tax bracket. All of these things mean that on aggregate, we earn way more money. But the second thing to point out is that other alternatives to raise funding is fucked on their side of the house, right? One, no one buys state-owned enterprises in times of recession because you're operating in a receding economy. But secondarily, like the IMF is probably not able to give you as many loans. One, because the IMF wants loans to be paid back, it is conditional in that way. But two, because recessions tend to be regional, right? So it is likely that if you're Bangladesh, you probably have India and Pakistan and Myanmar also in recession, which means the IMF doesn't have enough money to spend on every single country in the region all at once. So you have substantially more money in our side of the house. The second question then is, how does this money actually alleviate the recession, right? Two mechanisms. One, things like stimulus packages. The biggest problem in recession is that companies start earning less money, the economy starts to sort of degrow, and to cut costs, companies basically lay off workers. So people literally have no income on their side of the house. Uniquely, what the government can do then is divert money to the most vulnerable people, to those who are unemployed so they can stay afloat, to elderly people who aren't able to have disposable income and aren't able to access many crucial goods, right? But secondarily, able to subsidize crucial industry. Notice that developing nations oftentimes recede because specific cash cow industries which they have specialized upon fail. For example, in Bangladesh, that's like garments. In I think Myanmar is like leather or something of that sort, right? So you're able to subsidize selective sort of industries which uniquely fixes the root cause of recession. The problem on their side is that people generally use money irresponsibly. One, because people aren't financially literate, but two, because people will be risk averse in times of recession, consume even less, which worsens consumption pool in a recession on their side even more. We will explain way more harms from the later speeches, but for all these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much for that, Leader of Opposition. Rebuilding the case of the government. Deputy Prime Minister, please.
Give me just a second. Right. Fortunately for us, this opposition has kind of made this debate a one issue debate, and that is, if the government had more money, would it be better than if individuals have more money? And we think categorically, in the vast majority of cases where recessions occur, it's substantially better when you just give people more money rather than rely on governments to find ways to spend it efficiently. Secondly, if I get through that, I'll spend some time talking about IMF bailouts. But let's talk about the government versus individuals having money. The first thing I want to address here is the claim that, well, these people aren't paying very much tax, so the government or these individuals don't get very much more money. This claim is obviously not necessarily ridiculous, but just unproductive to the entire debate, for the reason that if people are not getting that much more money back as a result of our policy, it's unclear how the government is suddenly losing so much money as a result of this policy, right? What this claim achieves for the debate is just mitigating the entire thing. If you think people are not saving much money on our side, then you also must believe the government is not foregoing very much money. So it scales proportional to the rest of the debate. But in addition to this, I also think the claim is just untrue, because when you're paying 20% on the first income bracket on $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, that's a significant amount of money to you. That means a lot to people who are in this type of income bracket, and meaningfully increases the amount of money they have to spend and save. But let's talk about the bigger question, which is, why is government spending bad? We say a few things that get pretty poor responses from this opposition. The first claim we make is that government spending is often done in poor ways because governments are subject to huge amounts of corruption, subject to huge amounts of ineptitude. They're subject to lobbying and corporate capture, which means money is often spent in ways that are incredibly inefficient and inflationary. This team says two things to this response. The first thing they say is, not all states are corrupt. For example, states like the US go into corruption. The first observation to make here is, even with this example, which presumably is the best one they could come up with, clearly states are still subject to large amounts of lobbying and corporate capture. Like US senators are subject to political donations that make them more likely to donate towards businesses, not because they're efficient, but because they're their largest donors, which makes that stimulus inefficient, substantially more inefficient than the stimulus would be if it was just given to individuals to spend on the businesses that brought them the most value. Lobbying and corporate capture are not systems that are inherent to bad governments, they're systems that are inherent to all governments. But secondly, they also acknowledge later in their own speech that the types of states that are most likely to enter recessions are states that are most vulnerable, states like Bangladesh and like India, which are subject to huge amounts of corruption and corporate capture. So the types of contexts we're talking about in this debate, in a large number of cases, are states that are not just a little bit corrupt, but extremely corrupt, where outright bribery is not infrequent, where governments are often caught out for huge corruption scandals. And I think that's a pretty significant reason not to entrust governments with spending this money or finding the most efficient businesses. The second claim they make into our claim around corruption is that people are more likely to hold their government accountable during times of crisis, which means we can trust them to be corrupt. The first thing to observe here is this is just mitigation, because even if you're slightly more accountable in a time of crisis, but you were never very accountable to begin with, you're still relatively corrupt in the grand scheme of things. But secondly, they never actually mechanize the ways that people act on their desire to hold their government to a greater deal of account. That is, unless there's an election literally during the crisis, which is pretty rare, you're unable to execute that desire for accountability, and there's a relatively significant delay to it, during which time governments are subject to a huge amount of lobbying and corporate capture. But also, often the opposite occurs during a time of crisis. People are worried about what's occurring and therefore are desperate for the government to do literally anything, no matter what that thing is, because they just want the government to have some form of plan to take them out of a recession, which means they're not very good at understanding the nuance or capturing the minutiae of policy. Instead, governments are able to do terrible policy that people want because the government doing something makes them feel safe. That claim, therefore, I think stands, and the vast majority of this money doesn't go towards efficient businesses or efficient industries. It goes to the industries that do the most corruption, that do the most lobbying, which I think has a selection effect for being inefficient. The second claim we make is that government spending is often extremely slow, for the reason that government infrastructure projects take years or plans to execute, the fact that welfare systems themselves even require a lot of administrative effort to set up, but also the unresponded to claim we make, which is that spending is politically unpopular because people are worried about it causing inflation and don't like the idea of like giving money to poor people, which means when you propose welfare packages, huge amounts of political infighting occurs over what that welfare package should look like and whether it should exist in the first place, which means actually passing welfare packages through Parliament often takes decades, where comparatively getting tax cuts through Parliament is extremely popular because people have almost no aversion to the government stealing less money from people. This gets no response from the opposition, and what that explains to you is if you rely on government spending instead of reducing taxation, it takes months longer for the government to act on how to deal with this crisis than it would on our side. And in response to their claim that, well, welfare packages can be done quickly, obviously it might be easy to come up with the idea of a welfare package quickly, but it takes a long time to pass it through Parliament and actually execute it. The third claim we make then is that this doesn't actually deal with the root cause of recessions, which is a lack of consumer confidence. And this again gets no response. Because even if people, like, there is more money in the economy or people are receiving money from the government, they are worried about that money going away, which means they don't actually spend the money that they're given and they save their welfare checks in case things get worse and they squirrel it away. Comparatively, when people keep the money they earn, they see that as a more reliable source of income and therefore are much likely to spend it in ways that productively stimulate the economy. They say people don't notice when the tax system changes. Like, bro, have you ever had a job? Like, when you are paying taxes, you lose money. If the taxes go down, you have more money, which is, of course, something that people notice. I'll take the POI.
Your entire case is contingent on people having more money. Recessions lead to people losing jobs. How do these people get any money on their hands?
Like, this isn't the only form of welfare you do. You still do welfare for unemployed people. Most states have welfare for unemployed people even outside of times of recession. We're talking about additional stimuluses on top of the status quo, which obviously applies to people. But if you only provide stimuluses to people without jobs, you're just not providing enough stimulus to the economy. You need to provide stimulus to the vast majority of businesses in a recession, whether that is demand side or supply side, which is why you need to expand welfare beyond just people who don't have jobs and into people in low income brackets. For example, people who don't meet the tax-free exemption who are over the tax-free exemption threshold. The fourth claim we make then, which just again gets no response, is that this is allocated much less efficiently than the market would and becomes much more inflationary. Because governments are bad and cannot predict what kinds of businesses are most efficient. They often have pressures to do it equally and fairly, which makes it more inflationary. I think what that proves to you is it's just better, less inflationary, and more efficient for governments to entrust people with money. The next and final claim they make is that the IMF is unlikely to give you a bailout if you lower taxes. This is so unintuitive to me. The IMF puts conditions on countries to lower taxes and to be more liberalize their economies more, rather than the inverse. Lowering your taxes is more likely to get you an IMF bailout. But additionally, if their alternative is high spending and engaging in stimulus packages or other alternatives, that is what deters IMF investments, because they're worried about your debt to GDP ratio being too high and you entering into an inflationary spiral after the recession. Therefore, our side is the one that is actually more likely to get IMF bailouts and to get more support from loans. But we also provide you a number of other reasons why you're less likely to get IMF bailouts on their side. Things like having to lower interest rates, things like your currency being hurt, all of which reduce your capacity to take out loans. Very powerful.
Here. Thank you so much for that, Deputy Prime Minister. Building the case of the opposition, Deputy Leader of Opposition, please.
All right. This government team lose because their context limits them to a very narrow set of circumstances. When they claim that states who are corrupt, politically captured, and have weak infrastructure are likely to be the vast majority of this debate. Why is this structurally problematic for their own benefits in this debate? One, this is empirically untrue. Economic recessions affect states around the world, regardless of what their specific democratic systems are like. States also have a self-preserving incentive during crisis to reduce the levels of corruption they otherwise would want to engage in, because they also want to get things like more democratic aid from other countries who only want to offer this developmental aid in cases where countries themselves are shown to be more democratic. And thus, even if there's general incentives to be corrupt, you have to explain why the level of corruption is similar in that of crisis when you have other competing incentives. Two, the debate has to assume a somewhat reasonable context and a good faith government. And the reason for this is that when it comes to economic recession, the government is still going to be in charge of leading economic recovery efforts on either side. So this motion is only about income taxes. But if these states were as truly as corrupt as government claim, they would still be using other government revenue to restart the economy during times of crisis. You still have corporate wealth tax. You'll still be giving out stimulus packages. What this means is that if their characterization to be true, on either side, you're unlikely to rebound in a very effective way regardless. And so the margin of their harm isn't large. The more reasonable characterization of this debate is that states probably are somewhat reasonable and somewhat good faith, because this allows them to lead the economic recovery in a way that's fair to people. But third, as we point out in the POI, if these are areas with weak infrastructure, then their organic spending mechanism doesn't work, because these businesses are too small to rapidly expand from economies of scale, because they don't have business infrastructure in the region to quickly grow and restart the economy to a point where it gives people jobs once again. So using their own characterization, a lot of their context limits their own impact, because it's not clear to what extent the weakest of the weaker states would get a significant increase of change as a result of individuals spending this money domestically. All right, 3 issues. First, on alternatives. Secondly, on kickstarting economic growth. And thirdly, welfare for the most vulnerable. First, on alternatives. And I want to take them at their best. Even if you believe their mechanism that organic spending increases, there are some things which cannot be upkept through this organic spending. For instance, the upkeep of public transport infrastructure, such as trains. And these things are dependent on state funding. The reason is because public facilities are often maintained at a loss, because we want to make sure these things are accessible for individuals. Because if we set the price too high, then the majority of working class people can't use the train to and fro work all the time. If their funding model switches from state subsidies to consumer spending, then that is when you have to run these things at profit, because you no longer get the amount of upkeep from the state, which means it gets far less accessible to people. So even if you believe the general mechanism of organic spending is good, there are some things that cannot be upkept through that organic spending, which we protect under our side, because we give the government the leeway to ensure that they can fund these projects. Why is income tax the only way to get sufficient amounts of tax revenue? And no, they don't respond to the characterization from leader of opposition for why income tax is the best way to do this. First, in terms of the sales of assets and SOEs, where private firms are already bleeding money, and it's unlikely that they are willing to take on additional costs when the prospects of people getting their money, like having more consumers, is not very clear to them. But secondly, when it comes to international loans, such as from the IMF, there are lots of countries competing for these loans at once because these economic recessions tend to be quite regional in nature, that many people are suffering from the same things like epidemics or supply chain issues. But thirdly, especially when it comes to developing countries that borrow in other currencies such as the dollar, that debt accumulates and multiplies when the value of the dollar inflates. So even if they get these alternatives are worse off for them. And we explain protecting the way to get tax revenue, specifically from income tax, is because it's a reliable tax source that these people will be there and won't create further debt for you in the future. Second, on kickstarting economic growth. And here are structural reasons why governments are likely to utilize tax revenue well. First, there's extremely high amounts of democratic pressure. How you resolve economic recession becomes a critical issue at the ballot box, and failure to help people incites protest that threatens the government's legitimacy. For the reasons they give, if people are paying high amounts of tax during the recession, that's precisely why they'll hold the government at gunpoint, because there's impetus to track how they are using this money productively. Second, governments have access to huge amounts of data. So sometimes what people immediately want to resolve their desires in the first thing during crisis isn't actually what's good and beneficial for the country long term. Maybe this is what people want, but the profit margins in those industries are low. Governments are able to have technocrats and experts to decide what is the best industry to help us from economic recovery. And know that economic recovery is the most important thing in the debate because everyone is affected by this. So on a utilitarian basis, we think getting that as the main priority is what we win here. Thirdly, even if politicians have incentives to cater to corporate lobbies, they have competing incentives to be fair and equitable, because it's also good for both the companies, good for you, and good for the people to reel back from the crisis as quickly as possible. But fourth, even if they do target stimulus packages towards the lobbyists, these lobbyists are likely to be the biggest corporations. They are responsible for huge amounts of assets in the country. They're responsible for employing a huge amount of people. So even if they give money towards the big corporations first, we explain that's fine if that is what is needed during times of economic recovery. Because if these guys are able to shoulder all of the additional harms of people spending less in the economy, that's a good thing, because it means they're able to take on that risk. It means that these guys are able to ensure that we can have like heavy weights to pull us through the crisis. This takes down their material on corporate lobbyists, and unlike the burden push from DPM, we don't have to prove that all governments will be immediately fair, but we just mitigate the worst excesses of harm. Before that point,
your claim that technocracy is required because people's immediate desires are wrong is at tension with your claim that governments will effectively be held to account democratically.
Well, no, because we can employ a vast range of strategies to ensure that we utilize this tax revenue well. So we can have the politicians getting economic experts for how this is able to be used. So in some cases, democratic pressure is a good mechanism. And when we combine this with other factors, we get the best utilization of tax revenue. On your side, the only mechanism they have is people are able to self-select what's important for them in the moment, which doesn't necessarily lead towards economic recovery, because what people want may not be the industries with the highest profit margins. They can get more innovation. They can get more people hired into the companies during crisis. Here's why consumer spending will be done badly. First, it's a collective action problem. People are risk averse because they don't want to lose the limited money they have. So a majority of money people focus on personal savings instead of re-injecting money back into the economy. So you get things such as deflation. But second, it's more misleading information. Look at people at the start of COVID trying to get lots of toilet rolls, even though this isn't important for them and probably isn't important towards economic recovery. Third is on welfare. Note on government, they have less tax revenue overall. So it's actually their harm of helping the corporate lobbyists happen more on their side, because the limited money is spent on the MNCs. On our side, having more money in the pool in the first place means you can spend on both the MNCs as well as helping on welfare. So expanding the pool of available resources to governments is what lets them have additional money to spend on welfare for the most vulnerable. For all these reasons, oppose.
Thank you for that, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Crystallizing the case of government vote, please.
Hello, just checking I'm audible. Oh, sorry, I'll lower my hand. Lol.
You're audible.
Sick. Okay. The first observation I'll make is that the leader of the opposition just didn't effectively respond to my point of information. Because I ask, if they are right that this is a small amount of money, how do they claim a large drop in state spending on the kind of programs that they seem to really care about? Their response to that is to say, well, experientially, this doesn't feel like an important amount of money for poor people because they don't notice, which, as we point out, a Charlie to no response is absurd, but they never respond at all to the actual claim and thrust of that point of information, which is just that the amount of money we're talking about means far more in the hands of someone who is struggling to afford their groceries than it does in the hands of a state that has enormous amounts of revenue from other sources, or indeed in the hands of a big business that has the highest capacity in that economy to weather the storm of a recession. And the fact that they never effectively respond to that claim is fatal to their case, because all of the mitigation they try to do of their case, of our case, sorry, only mitigates theirs. Like, it is just the case that the amount of money that they say is small is more meaningful on our side of the house for reasons that we structurally explain that they never respond to. Two things then in this speech. Firstly, I will explain why we get people through the recession better on our side, and then I'll explain why we get out of the recession better also on our side. Firstly, getting through the recession. What I want to do basically here is ask what is better for consumers and businesses on the ground in an immediate sense, like what makes them more prosperous. A couple of things to say here. Firstly, the claim that we get from side opposition as to why our mechanism, which is just putting more money in the hands of people, doesn't work, is that lots of people don't pay tax or don't pay very much tax, and therefore they don't get very much money back. I think there are a series of problems with this claim. The first thing I want to say is I think it is just unclear that this is true. Like, if it is the case, as they claim, that vast swaths of people in a population are just paying no tax, I don't think they can get any of their benefits, because it is so unclear where states get the revenue base that they're able to do the massive subsidies and massive like bailouts of companies described by side opposition. So it must be true that in the states that both teams are talking about, people pay tax. I think that this is a true fact about the world, to be quite honest. But the second thing I want to note is just that like they talk about a set of stakeholders who maybe who don't benefit, but they just don't respond to the set of stakeholders who clearly do benefit. So they're quite uncomparative. That is to say that there are obviously a set of stakeholders who do pay tax, but are relatively poor, and we give them money, which means a lot to them, as I said in my introduction. And what I want to note here is that that is a set of people who have the largest propensity to spend money because they have the largest like amount of stuff they want. Like they're not incentivized to save this money because they have immediate things that they desire and that they are likely to spend. And that is incredibly important because it means that are going to be flow-on benefits to the local communities in which these people live. That is to say, it is generally the case that low-income taxpayers live around people who are unemployed or who do not pay tax because they are all relatively poor. They live in poor communities, which means if these people spend more money, they are flowing that money on to their community. There is a multiplier effect that occurs. But finally, I just want to know that the way that people pay tax tends to be like pay as you go, like your employer retains money from your income and gives it to the government progressively throughout the year, which means that this is an immediate and ongoing money that goes to these people, which I think is incredibly reassuring to them in a way that just getting a one-off check in the mail is not. What alternatives does side opposition provide for people? Firstly, they suggest that they will mail people welfare. This, I think, is rebutted by Deputy Leader of Opposition, who is like, but people will just save money if they just get a random check from the government. Yeah, so your model doesn't work. Secondly, though, I think it is just extremely unclear that they have enough money to do this well if their other pieces of characterization are true. I've already pointed this out. But finally, I want to note that I think it is extremely unlikely that this is done progressively, in that, as we explained, no response right from first speaker, the incentive for governments is to give everyone money because that is politically palatable. But the problem there is on our side, we scale the amount of money you get based on how much tax you pay, based on like where you are on the tax scale. So poorer people get more money. So it is more progressive on our side. Then they're like, we'll strategically fund industries. I'm going to go on to respond why I think this is macroeconomically a bad idea. But I want to note, I think this is bad for individuals on the ground because it is so unclear that this actually raises demand or consumption of these businesses' goods. There's no point just giving the leather industry money if no one can buy leather. So I think it is incredibly unclear why this makes people more prosperous. Clearly, people are better off on our side. I'll take a point now.
Reason the government can collectively earn a lot of money despite keeping individual tax burdens low is because the number of people that have motion effects is enormous. 1 million people paying $50 is still $50 million, right?
Yeah, but that's also the reason why the marginal change is small on your side, because they still have a lot of people paying tax. They still get a lot of money. Whereas for those individuals, there's no, like, it's all their money, right? Like, that's my point. Cool. All right, getting out of recessions. Let's talk about this. I just want to do some impacting here, which is on their infrastructure stuff, they're like, it's really important to be able to uphold trains. But this is contingent on them providing a valuable path out of a recession. Because if a country just stays in a recession, or if people are very poor for a long time, it becomes decreasingly possible for states to do things like subsidize in infrastructure like trains. So I want to note that that impact that they have is contingent. So I'm going to ask which side provides a more credible route out of recession. And I'm going to start by being extremely charitable and assuming that states spend money like relatively strategically and that they follow orthodox monetary policy, that is to say they cut interest rates. There are a series of non-contingent harms that we provide that they never respond because they get fixated on the corruption claim. I'm going to reiterate them for you so that you can see that we clearly win at this point in the debate. Firstly, we explained that reducing interest rates is an undesirable policy in many instances and would prefer to be cautious about it because you can only do it so much. There's a zero lower bound because it has currency impacts that makes it more difficult to borrow money because it reduces the value of your currency and it makes it harder to import goods, something you often want to do in recession. We explain that this means inflation goes up and makes foreign direct investment less appealing because it makes your currency less appealing and reduces returns on investment. This is very important because these are the things you need to get out of a recession. They never once respond to it because they just go nuts on the corruption claim. This is non-contingent on corruption. This is orthodox monetary policy. We just say you should be cautious about doing it. We also explain, though, that even when states are trying their best, they are allocatively inefficient because there are information barriers about what people need and about which businesses are likely to be productive. And they concede this because they're like, well, we're fine to only invest in big businesses if that's what's good to get out of an inflation, a recession. But they never explain why investing in big businesses is the way to get out of a recession. And the reason it isn't is because they have the most capacity to weather the recession anyway, and because they're the most likely to do things like state capture, which we described. And thirdly, because it is communities on the ground and local businesses who often have the most immediate ability to use that money because they are the ones who are struggling most. Finally, I just want to re-impact the corruption material. They basically concede this when they say weaker states are more likely to enter recession at LO. But additionally, they're like, people have an incentive to reduce corruption. Yeah, people always have that incentive. But the problem is any individual government has the kind of democratic pressures they describe, which we tell you are perverse, which means that they do things like give money to big businesses, give money to richer people. Those people are able to place democratic pressure on governments, which means that they never even effectively rebut this claim. So proud to go.
Here. Thank you so much for that, Government Whip. All right. Concluding for the substantial speaks, may I now call on Opposition Whip, please.
Hi. Yeah, just like a few seconds. We're gonna go on. Hi. Yeah. Hopefully I can be seen and heard. Pure that's fine. My pronouns are he, him. Right. I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Right. The problem with like a lot of these economies, and I think Umar's quite right. I think the context in government is what like misses a lot of the crux of like how certain things work, especially in like countries that like really desperately need money and are always in like economic crises when it comes to like recessions or like other issues, and how they operate and work. Most importantly, then we'll bring in the context, and I'll firstly like prove to you why the amount of money that they receive on their side is just extremely less, and why that in and of itself is like harmful enough for them to lose this debate. So what does Robaya tell you? Robaya comes and gives you like a lot of mechanisms as to why there's like much less money on golf. He tells you that firstly, small changes in these thresholds, especially in developing economies, are extremely massive, right? Because there is big economic disparity, but at the same time, the amount of like the scale of like small income and medium income is like much higher than large income, which means you increase the threshold for a bit. A lot of these areas are affected in which a lot of these people with low income and middle class income are just unable to pay tax. They cannot pay tax because of the threshold, right? Which means you have a massive amount of decrease when it comes to like the tax revenue that you get as the government. But more importantly, we tell you that there's this big part of this, like these developing economies, which is called the informal sector, right? Which means that a lot of people in countries like Bangladesh and India aren't really like, they don't have jobs that are contractual with the government, which makes them pay tax. They're often like hired as domestic help, or they're hired as chauffeurs or drivers, and these are like not contractual, and these are just word of mouth payments that you have with people who want you to work for them. Which means that in a lot of these areas, because these like hidden economies are massive in these economies like Bangladesh and India, often accounting for like 70-75% of the population, means that you already lose out on a lot of tax. The point in time in which you like increase the threshold, the amount of tax that you are able to receive goes down significantly more on their side of the house. Why do we then get more amount of money and tax revenue, which you can use for the betterment of society? Firstly, we tell you that the high population means that you're able to just get more money. But secondly, we tell you that this isn't really exploitive or coercive, because even if people are poor, there is something called progressive taxation. And the taxation rate is like unlikely to increase on our side, given that you're able to like earn more from like everyone equally, right? Thirdly, we tell you that in a lot of these economies, there are high growth rates. So there are rising entry salaries that you can use as tax, like on an income tax, which can obviously like operate good for you in society. How is this problematic for proposition or like for government? We concede that it is important to help people, especially like using welfare systems, people who are like old, vulnerable, or unemployed, because, and insofar we can prove it that they have less money, they're unable to help these people and are just likely to spend whatever money they have on big corporations, which makes vulnerable people, like the people who are unemployed, older, or like living on pension, much hard. Like it makes it much harder for them to survive in a recession, because they're unable to receive those stimulus packages or the welfare system that they also consider is quite important, especially when it comes to this context. The two things that I want to focus on then is like firstly on the efficiency in spending, and secondly on like self dependence, and why IMF bailouts and like other systems won't help you out, and why you need to survive on your own. The first thing on efficiency in spending, right? They tell us that the comparative over here is that people and consumers should be able to spend their own money. We give you multiple reasons as to why this is just not okay and why this is bad, right? Firstly, Umar comes and tells you that like a lot of these consumers, especially when it comes to recessions, will be risk averse, right? When you're a consumer, you'll have distrust in the government and in the state when you see that the economy isn't doing good. You'll probably not spend much, or even if you do spend, you'll spend extremely safe, which could lead to deflation, because the most important thing in society at that point would be to make money circulate around the economy. So you have somewhat of an economic activity. Because you have distrust and you have less information, you're unable to do so. Secondly, financial illiteracy, because like this debate shifted a lot to like poorer nations and corrupt nations. So we can assume that even then, like a lot of these people just don't understand exactly where to invest because of financial illiteracy, because of the lack of awareness when it comes to spending your finances the best way possible. So in a lot of ways, the investments and the spending that you have might just be incorrect. The markets that you pay, the industries that you like trust could just be bad industries. Thirdly, even if you're literate, there's a lack of information in a recessive economy. It might be misinformation, or it might just be that information is missing, because in a recessive economy, people are likely to shut down. Things that circulate are panic mode, and things that happen to you and the information that you receive won't always be like accurate and proper for you to be able to make that decision yourself. But fourthly, we tell you that even if you're like spending, you probably spend on industries that are like flashier, like real estate, or industries that have high profit margins, instead of industries that can like circulate the most economic growth and the most economic activity in societies. Oftentimes it could even be agriculture or other like smaller industries like garments that could be extremely massive for smaller developing economies. Why are then governments the best actor? We tell you first, they're accountable to people. The response they have is that, oh, but they have to wait till the next election cycle. Not really. You can protest, you can riot, and this has happened in multiple nations, because there's so much hostility and distrust in society. You'd be fed up if you see that this government is given into political capture or corruption. But more importantly, we tell you that technocrats exist, and the government's ability to hire people because of the pressure that they have in terms of democracies means that they're able to like give you the most information on where to spend, and also have the most information on where to spend, so they can help out economies like agriculture, which probably won't be helped by individual consumer spending, which help the vulnerable people in that industry. Before I move forward, sure.
If you're talking about states with high growth rates, they're clearly not in a recession. But also, as we've said like 30 times, our case is not context specific because firstly, most states experience lobbying. And secondly, most of our mechanisms aren't actually about corruption and they're unrebutted.
Right. Even if there's some amount of lobbying, I assume that when you're like, for this impact to be like big enough, then political capture would have to work in a way that your economy is hurt in a recession. And if that does happen, then I'm sure that people will understand that is happening, which again raises distrust, right? You as a government would want to avoid making people angry in a recession, given that they're already angry, which means you would want to invest and spend in places that are doing good and that can circulate the most amount of revenue, because that would help your country. Thirdly, we tell you that the informal sector, again, is extremely important simply because welfare is the best way that these people are helped out. Because these people don't work in official contractual jobs, just their ability to get that money means that you're able to help vulnerable people. We've proven to you why we have more money on our side for the government to spend. Why do we then talk about IMF bailouts? We tell you that there's less trust in these states because firstly, there's an inability to pay your loan back, and secondly, regional shocks, right? So if Bangladesh is like in a recession, then it's often like common for like other countries around it to also be suffering, which means that these other areas like IMF or like other nations are unlikely to help you out, which means that if this is a wash on both sides because there's distrust and there's an inability to pay loans back, then the side that wins is the side that's most self-sufficient. Because we've proven to you that we have more money, the government is the best actor, and people are just unable to make that decision. We're proud to oppose.
I'm so sorry I got disconnected, but I was able to hear the last type of the speech. Yeah. So as chair, I reverse the speaking order and invite the reply speaker for opposition. Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry for that mistake again. But yes, please proceed.
So two strategic observations. The first is that their meta response to our clarification is that if the poorest of the poor aren't paying a lot of money on their side, then we don't get a lot of tax money on our side. But we explain the difference to no response is that governments earn a lot from tax revenue overall. But on their side, the aid to people is less distributed because the number of people they are distributing to is a lot. So even if they have more money, the ways in which it's distributed to people is stretched thin because you have to help a huge amount of people because the people on their side are just way more people being tax exempt. On our side, because you're able to give targeted stimulus to businesses that are they're going to be productive with this, and you have data to decide how this is being used and then ensure that wasteful things don't occur, it means that on our side, even if you have less amounts of money, that money is being used more productively. So it's not actually a knife the case. But even if they take this down, it doesn't take down the rest of our case because the pathway to victory on opposition is that it's just good to have a larger pool of revenue because it's the best way for you to weather through the storm. Second, ironically, their characterization of politically captured states hurts them as well. Because if these were the most inefficient states, then you would be screwed on either side. So the margin of their harms do exist, but it's very limited. Because on either side, the government is still in charge of spearheading recession recovery efforts. So managing public health funds, instituting lockdowns, or using other forms of tax revenue that's not income tax in order to help government projects still exists. So on their side, these guys would still mess up. So the more reasonable characterization of the debate is where there is a reasonable difference, and that is when these governments are good faith. And their strategic pivot away from this framing in GovWhip is quite telling of this when they case shift to the monetary policy issue, which again, they never explain why their version of monetary policy is objectively better. And we explain that the reasonable context of the debate is when people are able to have that control of the money. Okay, two issues. First on economic recovery and secondly on welfare. First, economic recovery. We explained that expanding the pool of state revenue was critical because first, when it comes towards governments deciding where to spend their money on, people themselves have high democratic pressures to make sure that it's used in the most productive way, because the alternative is these governments will be condemned. And even if there are competing incentives for you to be corrupt, for you to care towards the political lobbies, they don't prove why the political lobbies are going to do things that are actively against the interests of economic recovery experts. Often we explain that they're aligned with economic recovery because them expanding means you're able to get more revenue, lead more innovation, hire more people. But two, things such as public trains cannot be consumer backed and they require state subsidies, argued in DLO to no response, because we need to have these things kept at a low cost to make sure that people can easily access them. Their only response is that MNCs have the capacity to weather through the recession anyway. So yes, we don't have to give the stimulus packages to those MNCs. Yes, that's the point. States have jurisdiction and data to decide which are the MNCs that are most productively using our stimulus instead. On their side, they have no guarantee that what the people want will be what actually helps you go through the crisis. Because even if these are the immediate desires of people, if these industries are not hiring way more workers, if these industries do not have high enough profit margins that allows them to innovate and bring prices up to the way they were before the recession, then there's no point even if they get organic spending, because the organic spending is a slow and ineffective mechanism. Second issue is that of welfare. And one of the biggest problems in recessions is unemployment. And they concede that the way to protect them is welfare. But here's why they can't spend money on welfare. First, because they concede they have less tax revenue in general. Number two, they concede that these states are politically captured. So in order of priority, they would spend more on corporations and bailouts, which is not a bad thing. But if you accept their characterization, then they limit their benefits. What we explained was that there's a substantial group of people that aren't able to benefit from just not paying tax because they don't have an income in the first place. On our side, people paying the income are those who are already slightly more privileged, and thus we can redistribute those funds to those that do not have a job, do not have an income, and that's when we get far more equitable forms of welfare. At the end of this debate, we get a massive benefit of carefully planned economic recovery, while their side is fleeting at best when they don't explain how organic spending leads you through crisis. For these reasons, pose.
Here. Thank you so much for that. Okay, concluding government reply.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
This team is like a dog chasing its own tail. They insist governments can be held to account to spend well, but also that governments are preferable because they employ unaccountable technocrats. They are hasty to mitigate how much money lands in the hands of low-income people. They even make the crass and absurd claim that poor people won't even realize that there's $1,000 more in their bank account, but also that this money is so profound that it brings public infrastructure to its knees and cripples government capacity to spend on stimulus and welfare. They insist that we have missed the context of the debate. The actual context is, as they say in second negative, not corrupt states, and as they say at third negative, states with informal economies and high growth rates, which is just not a real state, and it's certainly not a state that's in recession. In so doing, they just emerge with no win strategy, which means that we sail through with our three cases of where money gets spent better than it otherwise would. The first of which is where individuals, consumers spend instead of governments on businesses with stimulus. And we explain, and opposition reply tries to say we never explain why consumers spend better, but we did at my fucking first affirmative, which you opted in none of your speeches to respond to, which is that consumers organically spend on what gives them the balance between value for money and how much money they are spending, which means that they select robust and good sources of business, compared to government, which in some cases are very corrupt and are captured to spend on things that are enormously environmentally damaging and not very productive. That's a context that can't actually run away from happening in some cases, especially states that are in recession. But also, we explain that even if the state is not especially corrupt, that lobbying is something that is endemic to all democracies because of inequalities in how much money people have. And even if that weren't true, that the incentive politically to spend in an even way versus a productive way pushes governments away from the ways that consumers spend productively. All of which explains that consumers spend better than governments at getting countries out of recession because they select better places to sink their money, but also they spend more on what they need rather than what governments think they need, which is a good in and of itself. That's why we win that case. The second case is comparing welfare programs versus universally having more money from tax. And we explain that having everyone get some more money from lowering income tax is preferable to welfare programs. Firstly, because welfare programs have fewer access barriers, but and especially that's true if, right, like you believe there are a bunch of countries where people don't even have stable addresses where you could mail a check to. But also, they're less politically fraught, they're less delayed, and you can get more because tax is more popular to universally cut than is to set up a welfare program that is targeted, which is good as well. And it's more likely spent by people because it's seen as safer than getting a one-off check that's mailed to you, which means it's better at resolving problems that are caused by recessions. But also, we flip their claim about IMF spending here, which is that if governments are doing hugely inflationary welfare programs like mailing checks out to people compared to giving them money, because the IMF massively prefers you to lower tax because it reduces your debt to GDP ratio, then that means that you get more loans. Like they make this claim, they seed it into the debate, and then they make it our claim, like because they don't rebut it, which is weird. So we also win in that case about welfare programs. And finally, we win in an entirely unrebutted arena of the debate. We say that if you are not doing the kinds of things they're doing, you need to lower interest rates to promote spending more if you're not spending as the government to do it, which is undesirable because lowering interest rates reduces the returns on investment, which means you hurt foreign direct investment, making it harder to get out of recessions, and you hurt your currency value, which impacts your ability to import in times of recession, none of which gets a response. The conclusion of which should be for you that 1, consumers spend better than governments, that governments are far superior at putting hands in the hands of people who need it when they give everyone who pays tax more money, and people are better at preventing our model is better at preventing deleterious interest rate reductions, which is 3 independent reasons to vote affirmative. Don't vote for the team with a tail in their mouth.